Hello and welcome to Westchester Dateline, the talk show program that offers in-depth interviews with prominent people in the news. I'm your host, Dennis Rudin. We are taping our show at the home of my special guest, United States Congressman Joseph DioGuardi. Thank you for coming on Westchester Dateline.
Well, nice to be with you again, Dennis. Okay.
Since you last appeared on our show, one of the big problems that has re-emerged on the world stage has been the outbreaks of terrorism around the globe, namely the Achille Lauro incident and other vicious attacks on innocent victims at the Athens, Rome, and Vienna airports. What was your reaction to these incidents?
Well, my reaction was no different than any person who is just horrified by what they see. Certainly the spectacle of those bodies laying at the airport brings home that really no one is immune from terrorism, and we've got to do something to send out even stronger signals that we will not tolerate that kind of wanton killing, that kind of wanton abuse of people, innocent people, bystanders. I have right now a bill going through Congress. Actually, it's going to be put into the hopper when I get back from the recess. We've been drafting it, which formalizes a bounty system on terrorists. We will go for a $1 million bounty on the head of each confirmed terrorist. And the reason for that is I want these people to know that they're going to have on their forehead a $1 million price tag so that maybe ultimately their own people will turn them in. Now, when you consider the money that we spend right now when these incidents occur, and when you consider the non-financial costs, which are just horrible, $1 million is a pittance for a terrorist. I mean, even if we have 5, 10, or 20. But my feeling is that it might become a self-regulating mechanism because people will know that they're going to be looked for, no matter where they are, to get that bounty. We have kind of a bounty system already. You may have heard it in conjunction with the Achille Lauro, but it's very complex. It's somewhat discretionary, the State Department. I'm trying to pull it all together to formalize it, but to make it pointed and focused so that we have a nice round number, like $1 million on your head, if you're going to be one of these terrorists. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to dissuade every terrorist, because some of these people, as you know, are just nuts. They just feel that they can give up their life for a cause. But that's the kind of world we live in. But hopefully this will make a difference.
Are you sponsoring the bill yourself? You're doing it with a group of people? Any encouragement from the White House? What is it?
It's my bill, and I have already tested the waters with other congressmen, and they think it's a good bill, and I believe I can get the bill passed. But it'll be my bill. I haven't had any reaction from the White House on it at this point.
Is it feasible to have a mercenary, to raise a mercenary army, if need be, amongst nations to track down these terrorists?
I don't know how feasible that would be, but you raise an interesting issue. It would seem to me that if the UN were really effective, this would be an ideal role for the UN. I mean, we know we have peacekeeping forces that have been, I guess, somewhat marginally effective. And I guess the UN has really become a forum for dialogue to keep people talking, because where there's talk, there's hope. But my dream would be that the UN would see this as so transcendental in terms of beyond nationalities and national borders that it is a true role for it to play. And I would think nations should support that. And maybe we should have our country taking the lead in getting the UN to focus on that as one of its major activities to combat terrorism around the world. And maybe I'll suggest it the next time.
Several months ago, President Reagan met with Soviet Premier Gorbachev. Do you think the peace summit was a success? And if so, what signals has the president sent to Congress to indicate a possible shift in relations with the Kremlin?
Well, as I said before, where there's talk, there's hope. And I think that the summit was very successful when you put it in its perspective. Think a couple of years ago, Dennis, would you have thought about the day of two leaders, Reagan and Gorbachev, treating each other civilly, shaking hands, even having private meetings by the fireside? It just seems to me that that's a big step in the right direction. Not that they accomplished anything specific, but they did agree to meet again next year and the year after, no preconditions. I would have thought that that would be almost impossible based on the hardline rhetoric that we had been hearing just a year before. So I feel that they were successful in that we now have these two great nations talking, two powerful nations talking. I don't know how great the Soviet Union is. It's important that we understand another thing. The Soviet Union didn't come there because they were just happy to meet and talk. They have their economic problems right now. And I believe that the Strategic Defense Initiative was one big trump card that we had in getting them there. And it's working even now. Look at the proposal that was put on the table just a few days ago that we should now eliminate nuclear weapons by the year 2000, which I think is very interesting and I think is a very positive step in the right direction. I just hope that we can both do it together. The key is, I think we both want that objective. And even sooner if we can get it. There should be no nuclear weapons. The key is, can we trust each other to do it? Can we disengage bilaterally, not unilaterally, so that we don't have an unbalanced power? And you have to just remember that the Soviet Union has not fulfilled very basic agreements with us, like Helsinki. There are still Soviet Jews that can't get out of Russia, and they're being held hostage to the arms race, believe it or not. Now, I hope that'll improve. So the point is, if you can't trust them with a written agreement like the Helsinki Accords on human rights, can you trust them short of on-site inspections? But now we've heard Mr. Arbatov, the minister of the Canadian and U.S. Institute, I believe that's the name of it, he was on Ted Koppel's Nightline, that even mentioned on-site inspections might be doable. So again, there's hope there. So I'm hopeful. But I think the American public has to understand that while we see Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Arbatov with their hot Shafter and Mark suits on our television, we don't get a chance to get on their television. Press tends to be a one-way street, so we've got to just keep that and take it with a grain of salt, but not become so cynical that we don't see in what they're saying some positive elements so that we can get to the business of arms reduction, mutual arms reduction, and hopefully permanent peace in the world.
We'll be right back after this message.
A long time ago, my daddy told me to stay away from three things: fast cars, sweet-talking men, and cigarettes.
I said, honey, I quit smoking when I found out it was dangerous. And even then, it was tough to quit. So I said, be smart. Don't start.
Well, my daddy convinced me. I stayed away from cigarettes.
Now, what about those fast cars and sweet-talking men? What about them?
Turning to the domestic scene, when you campaigned for Congress, you complained that we needed some CPAs in government. Could you explain to the people about your proposed plan concerning the staggered filing of IRS tax returns?
Good. That's one of the several bills that I've either generated myself or joined with another congressman on that relate to accounting reforms and other structural reforms that I think would make government more efficient. Because my feeling is, Dennis, that we've got to get under the numbers. Waste is not one big thing on the surface. It's thousands of small things under the surface. Now, this particular bill was proposed by Congressman George Gekas of Pennsylvania, and he knew I was a CPA, so he came to me and he says, what do you think of it? And I says, George, I think it's great. There's probably some fine-tuning that has to be done, but the bill is basically this, that if you're born between January 1 and April 30th, you will file your tax return just as you do now on April 15th, the so-called Day of Dread. More people know April 15th than I think anybody else's except anybody else's date or birthday except their own birthday. Then if you're born in May, it will be May 15th, June 15th. What the bill says is that right now we got a crunch. Many people, or the majority, file their returns on April 15th. Now, some file before because they want to get their tax refunds back. No one will be precluded from doing that. So no matter when you're born throughout the year, you can still file your return as early as you want to get a tax refund. But to the extent that you haven't done that, then depending upon what month you're born in, that's the month you'd file your return. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, the government can't wait for its money, and that's now going to be depriving the Treasury of some money. I say not really, because right now we're on a pay-as-you-go system. W-2s get the bulk of your tax. If you're not on a salary, they have quarterly declarations where you pay, I believe now it's up to 90% of your tax in advance. You still have that. This will not change the filing for corporate returns, the 941 returns, which are your payroll returns, where the employer has to submit the money. This is just the return that the individual files, and even then, the individual may still want to get a extension. That would not be changed. But at least now, there wouldn't be this requirement that the first major filing would be on April 15th. I think this would do a lot to bring some order to the Internal Revenue Service. I think we've seen that the Internal Revenue Service has had a lot of problems with its computers.
Yes.
And also there was this horrible story that almost $300,000 in checks were being thrown out in a garbage can in the Philadelphia Bureau or Office of the Internal Revenue Service. Now, it probably has to be fine-tuned somewhat. We want to zero in more on whether or not there is a cash loss or cash deferral, because there may be some amounts of money that still have to be paid in with the return that you filed. But my feeling is the efficiencies will be so great, and the ability to cash manage so much better. Because right now I understand when the IRS gets all those checks in, it takes them weeks sometimes to deposit them. So that's money that's going without earning interest. So I'm going to ask some tough questions. I know the immediate reaction of the IRS is going to be, oh, it can't be done. I'm not going to accept that.
You are currently serving as the vice chairperson of the Republican Economic Task Force Committee. Could you give us some insight as to some of the goals and purposes of the committee?
The basic thrust of the committee, or the task force, is to think ahead, to think through the policy decisions that the Republicans should be focusing on in order to govern better, in order to help the House govern better. What we see in Congress, what I've seen in 1 year, to me is disappointing. A very reactive body. That's what Congress is. It tends to stay one step ahead of the sheriff, puts out fires, and it tends to micromanage things. For instance, I sat there for a week or two micromanaging the farm economy, and I said to myself, as a congressman, what am I doing setting price level supports on peanuts, on sugar, on corn? What I should be doing is coming up with a farm policy, maybe bringing the farm industry into the real world of the free economy, as opposed to all these subsidies. And many of them hurt. For instance, sugar price supports. That prevents third world countries that have probably nothing better to do than grow sugar and export it to us at a much cheaper price to pay off their debts. We're taking literally that away from them. And what's going to happen? Somewhere down the line, in order to protect our own national security, like in Nicaragua, we're going to have to somehow bolster those economies economically. Because what we're seeing in Nicaragua and these other countries is not really, it doesn't begin with political problems and military problems. They begin with economic problems. So we've got to learn from this experience and come up with policies. And that's why the task force is important, to kind of have a macro view of what we're doing so that we piece things together that are complementary and not as self-defeating, like a protectionist thing on price level supports for sugar, which is going to ultimately cause us a problem somewhere down the line when another economy falters and it becomes now easy prey for a Soviet, leader of some sort or socialist leader, and then we have to go back and figure out what's in it for us. And certainly, like in Nicaragua, it becomes a national security issue. It's just too close. So I'm saying let's piece this together now and look forward so that we don't allow these things to happen. Because once we let them happen, it's much more expensive to deal with it.
All right, what happens in the process? What I'm saying to you is you zero in on certain problems. Do you give them then to the House Minority Leader? Do you send it to the President because he's in your party? And have you sent any recommendations for any legislation, either to these appropriate people or tell us how the system works?
All right, well, just take a recent happening. You mentioned before you saw me chairing a panel. That was one of 3 panels that the Economic Task Force generated. And I was chairing the one to do with the budget. And we were lucky enough to get Senator Domenici to come over because he has a lot to do with that on the Senate side. And we had Trent Lott, and we had a number of congressmen. And we talked about the budget crisis. And we talked about some of the things that are difficult to talk about on the floor of Congress when we're trying to react to a particular problem. Here we're trying to get a better feel for what's causing the deficit, how we work around it. At that point, Graham Rudman wasn't yet being discussed, but it was kind of alluded to as one of the solutions, because Congress really can't seem to get its own act together. We can't seem to set our own priorities. And that's why you have something like Graham Rudman, which granted isn't perfect and maybe in some cases crude, but it doesn't have to be there if we set our own priorities. It only comes in unless we don't reduce the deficit by $36 billion a year. So we use these panels to kind of get a discussion going, to get a clearer understanding of what the subject is all about, what the thinking is all about from key people like Senator Domenici on the budget crisis. And then what we'll do is meet again as a task force to see whether or not we can come up with ideas that would lead to new legislation. We wouldn't necessarily go to the House, to the White House with it.
Well, who do you submit it to?
But we would then submit it to the Policy Committee, which would then have a compilation of ideas that they would then submit to all Republican members to see whether or not this would help in clarifying their thinking and help in getting legislation to deal with it.
You were responsible for sponsoring the Homeless Housing Assistance Act of 1985. How bad is the problem in Westchester County? And what are some of the key provisions of the bill and its status?
The homeless problem is, again, in the press almost every week, if not daily. And it's just a terrible problem. I don't think society can feel good about itself when you have people literally without a roof over their heads. And then it's not just vagrants. We're talking about people, families, who become dispossessed because they come into economic problems. And what I don't like is when I hear a Fleabag hotel operator in New York City made $2 million last year because the city paid that amount of money to put them in a hotel or a motel, and then I understand that we spent $7 million here in Westchester County, and we're doing something similar with a good part of that money. And think about it. We have families now in motels, and we're forgetting about the vagrant problem for the time being because you've got to separate this. They have to be given food allowances. The kids have to be bused back to schools. Hey, there's not enough money around to do that. So my feeling is we've got to go back to square one. And this is what my bill does. My bill has 3 parts to it. Immediately, to get the people off the streets. It's emergency food and shelter, so that in its first phase, it comes under the Department of the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Act. All right? In the second phase, where we have transitional housing, well, actually, the second phase deals with now rehabilitating houses and other places that we can use as more permanent shelters. We need emergency shelters. The second phase is more permanent shelters, and to apply some money to that. And then what I would call transitional housing is the third phase, where you get those people back to independent living somehow through some transitional housing and training so they can get back into society. One of the major things that we can do with this bill is identify what the problem really is. I don't think that we have a good idea yet as to who these homeless are. Just taking from my experience on the board of the Phoenix House, where we took a population of 50 people off the streets, homeless, and what we found out was something very interesting, that some of them really shouldn't have been on the streets. They should have been in some kind of institutional care, because they did have some mental problems. Not as many as you might think, but they were there. And others were really entitled to things, whether it was food stamps, Social Security, but they didn't know how to apply, they didn't have an address. So I think we've got to do a better job in identifying who these people are and seeing how we can deal with them in a better way than just putting them in a motel where we make some hotel and motel operators rich. It would seem to me that the county can take some of those millions of dollars and now rehabilitate some houses along with some matching funds from the federal government and come up with transitional housing and then ultimately get these people some independence.
On previous occasions on the show, we have talked about the constantly changing state of our economy, from a heavy industrial economy to a high-tech service economy. You have recently co-sponsored legislation to help displaced workers deal with this problem, the National Training Incentive Act. Could you tell us a little bit about the bill and how do employers enroll in the program?
This is a bill I joined with Nancy Johnson from Connecticut on, and I think it's an important bill because we need to keep people working in this country. When people work and kind of help themselves, we have to help people help themselves, they feel better about themselves. I think I mentioned this before, one of your other shows, and I believe in what Maimonides said, that we shouldn't give a man a fish, but teach him how to fish. And that's what this is all about. It, on the one hand, allows employers a tax credit for those workers that are displaced. It's a recognition that we are in a transition from an industrial-based economy to a high-tech information-based economy, so that there are going to be renewed pressures on training people, and there are going to be people who will be out of work who will not be able to get those same jobs back. So there's going to have to be some kind of impetus, some kind of outside agent used to help. And on the one hand, I'd like to see the employers who take these people and retrain them given job credits, tax credits. On the other hand, the employees themselves should be able to use their IRAs, their individual retirement account, to do some training for this new work, and they should be able to have access to that money without penalties for premature withdrawal. So basically, that's what the bill seeks to do.
Another problem for many families today is the tremendous cost of education. You recently co-sponsored the Education Savings Accounts Bill. Can you explain to us the provisions in the bill and the current status of the legislation?
Again, that bill is in the nature of a series of things that I want to do to promote savings in this country. Dennis, when I joined in Congress last January before, a year ago this January, the same personal savings rate was 5.7%. Japan was already over 15%. Now, we're below 3%. The press announced about a month ago. Japan is still over 15%. We just talked about going from an industrial-based society to high-tech. That takes capital. Capital comes from savings. Well, what this particular bill would do would be to encourage savings, but maybe for a specific reason, because it works like an IRA. To the extent that you have a child, until the child reaches 19 or into college, you're able to put away $1,000 a year. You'd be able to take that money, just like an IRA, from your adjusted gross income as, in effect, a deduction on your tax return, and that money builds up now in preparation for the child's education, tax-free. And I think today, with the cost of education spiraling as much as it is, getting higher and higher, that this would be a good way for families to save for education. Now, while the money is there, IRAs, as you know, are vehicles that banks use to attract money. And this would be the same kind of thing. That money sits in the bank. It is relent. There's the capital that we need, the multiplier effect, the economic multiplier effect. It works like an IRA. So this educational savings account would provide the same kind of thing. It provides capital now to rejuvenate business or recapitalize, and the money is there at a time when the child goes to college, so that now we don't have to have this family run and find thousands of dollars for the child's education. So I think that's what America is all about, saving in anticipation of things as important as that. And I kind of like it because we're on a consumption binge right now. We got debt coming out of our ears when you look at international, consumer debt, corporate debt, and the domestic $2 trillion deficit. You know, you heard me say that's the good news. That's what's on the books.
Yeah.
You can't believe what's off the book. So I'm going to promote as much savings as I can. And this is one good way to do it.
Westchester County has always been concerned about the environment. You voted for the Superfund Amendment, H.R. 2817, which would add cancer-causing and other chemicals to the list of substances for which emissions data must be disclosed by business firms handling toxic chemicals. What is the status of this legislation now, and how will it affect Westchester County and its businesses?
Well, I hope no business is hurt by the bill, but in balancing whether or not business could be hurt in some way, or whether it be a few more additional costs against the positive aspects of the bill, right, and that's the public's right to know. I felt strongly that the public's right to know took precedence. We've heard a lot of things about chemical leaks. We've heard about the disaster in Bhopal, and I guess that's now given us a renewed focus on the problems of chemical plants. I think people who live around chemical plants have a right to know what they're living around. Okay? And maybe it's my background as a certified public accountant. It's called full disclosure. And that's what we like. That's why there are a lot of footnotes on financial statements. We can't put everything on a balance sheet, but to the extent we can't, we'd like to at least know that it's disclosed. I feel that with the horror stories we've heard with asbestos, with PCBs, and other carcinogens, that we need to do a better job in alerting the public to the presence of these terrible chemicals. Now, that's not to say that I want to put a straitjacket on business. And I just feel that the additional costs involved are well warranted when you realize that there are people's lives at stake. And I think the public has a right to know. That's all I'm saying.
Congressman, I'd like to thank you for inviting us into your home and visiting with you today. Thank you for coming on Westchester Dateline. My special guest has been United States Congressman Joseph DioGuardi, representing the 20th CD. This is Dennis Rudin saying so long for Westchester Dateline.